Whenever I make a public appearance, I immediately get mobbed by my adoring fans. And one of the most common questions they ask me is, what is a day in the life of Mr. B-Tongue like? Well, every day is different, of course, but I can tell you what I did today. Today, I put the new Puff Daddy CD in my Discman, got on my Razor scooter, scootered on down to the barbershop, and told him to give me the Rachel. Why? Because 1998 is back, baby. Big, top-down, dense, isometric, turn-based to real-time with pause, lots of dialogue, lots of quests, lots of bad guys, lots of loot. Just look at this screen full of confusing stuff. Look at it! This sort of thing is the whole reason they invented computers in the first place. Google it if you don't believe me. And it's not just one game, but many. The Shadowrun people have already released 3 different campaigns. The spiritual sequel to Baldur's Gate is midway through its first expansion, the spiritual sequel to Planescape Torment is currently under development, and the plain old sequel to Wasteland is going to be ported to consoles. Wasteland 2 on consoles. 5 years ago, that was longer odds than Half-Life 3 on the iPhone. So, the great Infinity Engine do-over of the 20-teens is underway. 1998 is back. But it's not all the way back. There are some trends that are easy to avoid, like over-the-shoulder cameras, shooter mechanics, and fully voiced dialogue. But there have been other changes in RPGs over the last 15 years or so. Changes that are not so obvious, changes that took place beneath the surface. Changes that stubbornly persist, even if you switch to an isometric view, pile on RNG mechanics, and deliberately cultivate an old-school sensibility. As good as these games have been, and so far they have been good, I feel like there's still something missing, something hard to describe. Something that can only be expressed through tedious griping. Part 1. Tedious griping. I'm going to single out 2 specific criticisms that I mean to use as examples of a larger concept. The first is of Obsidian's Pillars of Eternity. It'll include a discussion of gameplay elements, but no story spoilers. The second is of Wasteland 2, and will contain relatively minor mid-game spoilers. I'll let you know when they're about to show up. First, Pillars of Eternity. In case you haven't played it yet, this is the much ballyhooed spiritual successor to the great Baldur's Gate series, the rock upon which BioWare's reputation was initially built. Pillars was a well-reviewed game, and rightly so. It hit many of the same sweet spots as Baldur's Gate did. A big, sprawling story, an engaging setting, interesting characters, and lots of side content. But I have a bone to pick with Pillars. It's too balanced. Record scratch. Too balanced, you say? How can something be too balanced? Isn't balance a good thing? Well, yes, balance is a good thing, but it comes with a cost. Game development is often an exercise in trade-offs. For example, scope versus polish, or complexity versus accessibility, or player freedom versus narrative focus. To these 3 examples, you can add a 4th, balance versus variety. These 2 qualities are not in direct opposition to each other, but in practice they often come at each other's expense. After all, the more stuff you have in your game, be it classes, spells, enemies, status effects, or items, the more likely it is that some of it will disrupt balance. Baldur's Gate 2 is a good example of this dynamic in action. The game was packed to the gills with variety. It also had its fair share of cheese. There are dual-class combinations that make soloing the hardest encounters in the game not only possible but easy, high-level spells that are hilariously broken, and encounters that can bring first-time playthroughs to a screeching halt. Hell, the first time I saw Black Razor, I damn near fell out of my chair. It does what when you hit an enemy? And yet despite this, or possibly in part because of this, the game is rightly considered a classic to this day. In Pillars, by contrast, everything is cautious, balanced, safe. Whatever odd whiffs of camembert lingered around the game at release have since been patched out. To me, there's something sterile and disappointing about that. Some of you may agree with me, and some of you may disagree. Either way, keep it in mind as I move on to my next example, Wasteland 2. Wasteland 2 has too much choice. Double record scratch. But wait, you say. Player choice is a key part of the RPG experience. How can there be too much? The answer is that I'm engaging in calculated sophistry for the sake of the record scratch gag. It's not quite right to say that Wasteland 2 has too much choice. It's more that much of its choice is overly engineered. I'll compare 2 choices in particular, one big and one small. And, by the way, here come the spoilers that I warned you about earlier. First, the big one. Early on in the game, your squad of rangers gets 2 separate distress calls, one from a town called Highpool and one from a place called the Ag Center. You can only save one of them, whichever place you don't respond to meets with catastrophe. This particular early game choice was featured heavily in the game's marketing as its example of a reactive world. And sure, it's a choice and it has consequences, but I personally wasn't too engaged in it. After all, I wasn't emotionally invested in either place. In fact, I had only just learned they existed a few minutes before. The choice between them seemed forced, arbitrary, and worst of all, artificial. I got the impression that instead of inhabiting a reactive world, the game was just giving me the choice of one railroad or the other. Let's contrast this with another, smaller choice a bit later in the game. One of the recruitable rangers is a woman named Angela Death, who is hurt and angry over the loss of her friend Ace to an unknown killer. Later, at the Rail Nomads camp, you find a witness to Ace's death, who is able to escape alive. After he tells his story, Angela kills him for running and for failing to save her friend. A straight-up, cold-blooded revenge killing. Not the sort of pastime the supposedly good guy rangers are supposed to be indulging in, but there it is. The game never gave me the chance to chew her out properly, but it did give the option, as it does with all rangers, to kick her from the party. Which is what my character, who was a lawful good type up to that point, should have done. But then I remembered that this was partly my fault. After all, General Vargas earlier had warned me against taking Angela for exactly this reason. I realized that I still felt some camaraderie with the character that had bailed me out in several firefights. I knew that she had the highest assault rifle skill in my not very optimized party, and that the game was just hard enough for that to really matter. So I looked the other way. I kept her in the party, mentally adjusted my PC's alignment down to lawful neutral, and chalked the whole thing up to the wasteland's ability to corrode the characters of its inhabitants. And let me assure you, for me, that choice was much harder than the one between the Ag Center and High Pool, and it left a more lasting impression. So, we have two separate criticisms of two separate games, too much balance in Pillars of Eternity and too much choice in Wasteland 2. At the beginning of this section, I promised to use these examples to illustrate a larger concept. That concept, which I'll describe in Part 2, is setting supremacy. This is a phrase I've made up to describe the game development habit of giving the game's setting a high priority when making design decisions. Whenever you make a game, you set priorities. For example, some cash-grab Facebook game might put a high priority on addictiveness and a low priority on strategic depth. Or an arena shooter might put a high priority on FPS and a low priority on story, while an adventure game does the opposite. Games of every genre set dozens of overlapping priorities over the course of their development. In the case of RPGs, one of these dozens is that of game design versus game world. To illustrate this, let's look at two hypothetical games, RPG A and RPG B. RPG A is developed with game design taking priority over the game world. So, first they develop sound systems, ones that are transparent, intuitive, and have the potential for strategic depth. They make sure that everything is balanced, that there are no game-breaking tactics, and that there's a well-managed difficulty curve. Then, this work is passed off to the writers, who are expected to create a game world that fits these restrictions. They're also instructed to make sure that there are a couple big-ticket, marketing-friendly choices in there somewhere. In the hypothetical RPG B, the pipeline is reversed. In RPG B, the writers create a world that's varied, interesting, evocative, and logically and thematically consistent, and they create it without regard to game mechanics. Then, that work is passed off to the designers, who attempt to fit their design into the fictional framework given to them. Any reactivity or player choice is an organic product of in-universe circumstances. The second of these two games, RPG B, is an example of setting supremacy at work. Now obviously games in the real world won't be so clear-cut, and it's not always possible to determine after the fact what philosophy drove their content. But these are hypothetical cases, made to illustrate a concept that I think is useful for describing RPG development. Looking back at the Infinity Engine era through this lens can give us a sharper picture of what was going on. By modern standards, those old games were full of jagged edges. Opaque systems, obvious dump stats, poorly balanced skills, kits, and items. It's easy to look back at that stuff as just plain jank, the growing pains of an adolescent genre often imported from pen and paper systems. And in some cases it was, but in many cases it was something else. Something where the fictional world was treated as real and valuable, and which resisted compromise for the sake of textbook design. But when I look at those games next to the games of today, I see a lot of compromise. I see magical items that choose their effects from a non-threatening, carefully curated list. I see artificial-seeming, heavily signposted choices included because that's the sort of thing we're told RPGs are supposed to have. I see a genre that's gone all respectable on us, that's gained polish but lost some of its radical sensibility. That's a shame, because I believe it was that radical sensibility that made the old classics memorable, that made them strain with such vitality against the boundaries of their medium. It's time to bring that quality back. What I'm saying is, if you're making a game world, you should cultivate a calculated arrogance on behalf of your own creation. The players are guests in your world. In fact, the game itself is a guest in your world. And while you should treat guests with hospitality, you don't rebuild your house for their sake. Note that I'm not suggesting you abandon balance and choice. Balance and choice are valuable things. These are still RPGs, after all. They just don't have to always occupy the highest rank on the hierarchy of importance. Having to adjust your game mechanics to the internal logic of a fictional world also encourages creativity. You may find solutions that allow you to have your cake and eat it too, creating unique and memorable mechanics that owe their inspiration to the limitations they were forced to work around. After all, tabletop RPGs themselves grew out of the tradition of pen and paper wargaming, which often aimed for realism over elegance in design. I mean, if all I wanted was good design, I'd be playing chess. An engaging world can cover for a multitude of weaknesses in design. It can even turn them into strengths. Those old, low-intelligence Fallout builds were far from optimal, but they were also far from boring. Even choices that the game doesn't explicitly account for can be interesting role-playing hooks. Now, of course, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to choose. In a perfect world, games would be glittering, flawless marriages of setting and design. In the real world, you're going to have to confront this issue sooner or later in the sausage-making process. So I'm asking you, when that time comes, be it sooner or later, remember that you can bend crunch for the sake of fluff. You can bend marketing-friendly choice mechanics for the sake of fluff. That's part of what gives RPGs their unique appeal, and gives them that brand of weird that made the classics classic. Coming up next, are you tired of pleasant, relaxing videos? Tired of generally enjoying your time on YouTube? If so, then you are in luck, because my next video will feature a topic that may make for a very stressful, uncomfortable vibe in here. I'll just assume you're looking forward to that. See you soon.